The scent of clove and roasted pork hung heavy over the dining room table. It was the smell of a carefully maintained Midwestern holiday. At the head of the long oak expanse stood my father Richard. He held a crystal wine glass high, catching the yellow glow of the overhead chandelier. His smile was smooth and practiced, carrying the familiar warmth of a prosperous Iowa farmer, expecting nothing less than quiet compliance from his audience. I sat at the exact opposite end of the table. It was the chair I had occupied since childhood, the furthest point from the center of attention, the designated spot for the daughter whose only job was to be invisible until she was needed. Richard cleared his throat, and the chatter of 14 relatives died down. He delivered his annual toast, praising the value of hard work and the sacred bond of our bloodline. Then his gaze shifted down the length of the wood and locked onto me. He announced to the room that he was especially proud this year because Skylar was stepping up to help her brother. He said the words stepping up the way a general commends a soldier for volunteering to take a bullet. He told the gathered aunts and uncles that carrying each other's burdens is what this family is all about. Aunt Linda beamed from her seat near the centerpiece, her hands clasped together in genuine, ignorant joy. Uncle Dave offered a solemn, approving nod into his linen napkin. Down my right side, my older brother Connor leaned back in his chair. He took a slow sip of his beer and offered me a faint, self-satisfied smirk. Connor was the business owner, the dreamer, the son who was allowed to fail because there was always a safety net waiting to catch him. For my entire life, I had been that safety net. I was the shock absorber, the one who swallowed every unfair demand and skipped my own vacations so Connor could maintain his comfortable life. The room filled with a round of polite applause. It was the sound of a family celebrating my submission. I did not nod in return. I kept my face perfectly still. My right hand rested out of sight below the edge of the tablecloth. My thumb traced the cold metal teeth of a zipper on the heavy leather tote resting against my winter boots. I am 32 years old, and I work as an agricultural loan officer. My days are spent evaluating risk-verifying assets and reading the paper trails that desperate people hope I will ignore. I do not deal in sudden outbursts. I deal in ledgers. And the ledger I was keeping in that bag was going to tear the foundation of this farmhouse down to the frozen dirt. I let the applause ripple through the warm dining room. I felt the steady, measured beat of my own pulse. My hands did not shake. This unnatural composure was the product of 3 decades of training. I was the girl who never made a scene. I was the woman who accepted the smallest piece of pie, the daughter who paid her own way through state college, while her brother attended a private university out of state. I was the one who listened to my parents' claim that times were tough and quietly worked double shifts at a local diner, smelling of fryer grease and loose meat sandwiches just to make my rent. I had spent a lifetime biting my tongue and smoothing over the rough edges of my family's demands. That lifetime of silent practice was the very reason I could sit there letting them preen in their false safety while I held the pin to a grenade. I watched my mother Diane fluttering near the kitchen door, playing the role of the exhausted, noble matriarch. She wore a tailored wool sweater and a modest string of pearls, projecting the image of a woman who had weathered agricultural hardships with quiet dignity. She caught my eye and offered a thin, tight smile. It was a smile that demanded cooperation. In her mind, the deal was already done. The bridge loan Connor needed to save his failing farm supply business was as good as signed. She thought my silence was surrender. She thought the leather tote at my feet contained the banking forms she had pressured me to bring. My thumb pressed harder against the zipper. I calculated the distance between my father's raised glass and the floor. I noted the way Connor's expensive watch caught the light, a watch purchased during a year. I was told the family could not afford to fix the broken furnace. As an underwriter, you learn to detach the emotion from the numbers. You look at the debt-to-income ratio. You look at the history of withdrawals. You look for the discrepancies between what a client claims and what the ink actually proves. Sitting in that dining chair, I was no longer a daughter participating in a holiday meal. I was an auditor finalizing a foreclosure. I watched Uncle Dave reach for another dinner roll. He was a man who worked his soybean farm with his own 2 hands, a man who believed a person's word was their bond. Beside him, Aunt Linda adjusted her napkin, her face glowing with the kind of innocent trust that only survives if you refuse to look too closely at the people you love. They had no idea that the prosperous farmer sitting at the head of the table had built his entire public persona on a foundation of hidden theft. They did not know the cost of the wine they were drinking. I knew the cost. I had paid for it with every missed opportunity, every late night studying in a freezing apartment, every tip I scraped together serving hungry travelers off the interstate. My silence was the currency this family traded on. I looked back down the table at my father. He took a sip of his wine, savoring the vintage, savoring the applause, savoring his own undisputed authority. He lowered his glass and met my gaze, expecting to see the familiar, yielding softness of a daughter, eager to please. I gave him a blank, unreadable stare. The leather of my tote felt cool and rigid against my leg. I let my thumb rest heavily against the zipper pull. We were trapped in that single suspended second, the quiet space right before the drop. I took a slow, quiet breath. I let the warm air fill my lungs. I did not know yet that I was about to bury the only version of my mother I still loved. To understand the gravity of the folders hidden inside my bag, you have to go back exactly 2 weeks. The winter wind was howling off the empty frozen cornfields of the Iowa prairie. The sky was the color of a bruised knee, a flat, heavy gray that promised ice. I had driven an hour out of Des Moines, my heater running on full blast, just to fulfill a weekend errand for my mother. Diane had called me on a Thursday morning, her tone brisk and expectant, asking me to come to the farmhouse and bring down the vintage holiday decorations from the attic. Her knees were acting up, she claimed, and Richard was busy in the machine shed. It was a task Connor could have easily done since he lived 10 minutes down the county road, but Connor was never summoned for dusty labor. I parked my car near the frozen tractor ruts and walked up the gravel path to the side door. The farmhouse was drafty, the old window panes rattling in their wooden frames. Diane met me in the kitchen, handed me a mug of lukewarm coffee, and immediately gave me my instructions. She was highly specific. She did not just want the standard boxes of garland and artificial wreaths. She wanted a specific plastic tote tucked away in the deepest corner of the rafters. Inside that tote, wrapped in layers of yellowed tissue paper, was a hand-blown glass angel. My grandfather had made that angel before he passed away. He was a quiet, steady man who smelled of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He was the only person in this family who ever looked at me like I was an asset rather than an obligation. The glass angel was beautiful, catching the light in a way that made its fragile wings look like spun ice. Diane insisted it needed to be the centerpiece of the tree this year. It was a sacred family object, a piece of our history that we displayed to prove our roots ran deep and true. She handed me a flashlight and pointed toward the hallway. I walked down the narrow corridor and pulled the cord for the attic hatch. The wooden stairs unfolded with a loud wooden groan, groaning under their own weight. A blast of bitter cold air washed over my face, carrying the sharp scent of dry rot old newspaper and fiberglass insulation. The attic was an unheated pocket of the house, a place where the harsh continental winter settled and stayed until April. I zipped my coat higher against my neck and pulled my gloves tight over my fingers. Every step up that ladder felt like a continuation of the same tired routine I had walked for years. I was the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one who did not ask questions when the family ledger favored my brother. I climbed higher, letting the darkness of the attic swallow the light from the hallway below. The cold air stung my cheeks and made my eyes water, but I kept moving. I thought about the glass angel sitting somewhere in the dark, waiting to be brought down and admired. I thought about how fragile it was, and how carefully I would have to carry it so it would not shatter on the hard wooden steps. I had spent my life carrying this family the exact same way, stepping carefully, tiptoeing around my father's temper and my mother's fragile ego, ensuring nothing broke. I hoisted myself onto the rough plywood floorboards of the attic, brushing a stray cobweb from my shoulder. The wind beat against the roof shingles above my head, sounding like a distant drum. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the dusty expanse, searching for the plastic totes my mother had described. I was completely alone in the freezing dark, searching for a delicate piece of the past, unaware that I was standing mere inches away from a heavy metal box that held the truth about my future. The attic was cold enough that my breath plumed white in the beam of my flashlight. Dust motes drifted through the pale cone of illumination, like tiny suspended snowfalls, trapped under the pitched roof. The temperature in the uninsulated space had to be in the single digits, dropping lower whenever the prairie wind battered the exterior shingles. I stepped carefully across the plywood planks, avoiding the exposed pink tufts of fiberglass insulation that lined the joists. My mother kept her holiday storage meticulously organized near the access hatch, but the back corner near the eaves was a graveyard of discarded furniture and stacked cardboard. I swept the light across the shadows and found the red and green plastic tote pushed against a supporting truss right where she said it would be. The plastic lid was stiff from the freezing air, and it snapped loudly when I pried the edges upward. Inside, a layer of yellowed newspaper and tissue paper protected decades of Midwestern domestic history. I knelt on the hardwood and began lifting out the familiar items. I pulled out a tangled string of ceramic lights and a wooden nutcracker missing a painted arm. Then, carefully wrapped in a thick cocoon of quilted fabric, I felt the smooth, cool curve of the hand-blown glass angel. My grandfather had shaped that fragile glass with his own hands. I unwrapped the quilting just enough to check the wings relieved, to find them unbroken in the freezing dark. As I shifted my weight to place the angel safely on the floorboards, my knee bumped against something hard buried at the very bottom of the plastic tote. It did not yield like holiday decor. I dug past the remaining crushed tissue paper, and my gloved fingers brushed against cold, heavy steel. I pulled the object out into the flashlight beam. It was a metal cash box painted a dull utility gray. The surface was scratched and worn, indicating years of handling. A cheap brass padlock secured the front latch. Diane had sent me up here for a delicate ornament, oblivious to the fact that someone else had used her sacred holiday storage as a hiding place. The box rattled slightly when I lifted it. I assumed it held old property tax returns or outdated tractor warranties, since farm families always kept paper records long past their required expiration dates. The brittle lock was rusted and flimsy. I wedged the flat edge of a discarded metal shelving bracket under the clasp and pressed downward with my body weight. The cheap brass snapped with a dry metallic pop. I pushed the lid open, expecting the musty scent of ancient tax forms. Instead, I found thick bundles of paper secured by dry, rotting rubber bands. I pulled the top stack out and aimed my light directly onto the top sheet. It was a glossy, heavily branded player account statement from a riverboat casino in Davenport. Beneath it sat a curled automatic teller withdrawal slip from a gambling resort in Omaha. I pulled out another stack from the gray tin. More statements appeared. More withdrawal slips documented cash advances carrying brutal interest fees. Comp points logs showed tier statuses reserved solely for high-volume gamblers. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. I did not narrate my own heartbreak into the empty air. I am a loan officer. When confronted with a disordered pile of financial documents, I do the only thing my brain is trained to do. I started adding. I sat cross-legged on the freezing plywood, balancing the flashlight on my collarbone, and flipped through the slips one by one. I kept a running tally in my head, grouping the thousands, the hundreds, the ATM surcharges. 5,000 lost in October. 2,000 withdrawn on a random Tuesday in March. Another 4,000 drawn directly from the casino floor over a single holiday weekend. The numbers piled up, stacking higher and heavier in my mind. Midway through a thick bundle from the year 2009, I stopped. I pressed the freezing metal tin hard against my sternum. I realized I could not feel my fingers anymore, and I knew with undeniable clarity that it was not the winter air causing the numbness. The chill was radiating from the inside out, starting in my chest and spreading to my extremities. I forced myself to lower the tin and finish the arithmetic. I turned over the last receipt and added the final figure. The total sum across all the banded stacks landed at $88,000 and change. It was close enough to the $92,000 trust my grandfather had left me to make me physically sick. A clean match is a smoking gun, but a real analyst knows that a near miss is far more terrifying. A near miss means the rest of the funds were bled out in untraceable cash, unrecorded, leaked through gas station withdrawals and convenience store stops. The core bulk of my stolen education was right here accounted for in bright casino ink. I reached back into the tin to gather the last of the scattered slips, and my fingers grazed the bottom. There was one more item lying flat against the cold steel beneath the rubber bands. It was a thick Manila County envelope folded neatly in half. The return address belonged to the county recorder of deeds. Across the front, someone had scrawled a single word in blue ink, reconveyance. I stared at the letters illuminated by the fading beam of my flashlight. As a banking professional, I knew property terminology very well, but the context here made no sense. Why would a real estate filing share a hiding place with a decade of gambling losses? I turned the envelope over, noting the unbroken seal on the back flap. I told myself I needed to deal with the casino receipts first. I could not process another variable while the floor of my childhood was currently dropping out from under me. I set the envelope back at the bottom of the tin unread. I placed the rubber-banded stacks over it, pressing the lid closed until the broken latch caught and held. I gathered the fragile glass angel, wrapping it securely in its quilted cocoon, and tucked it under my arm. I picked up the gray metal box with my other hand, holding it tight against my side. I walked backward down the creaking attic stairs, stepping from the freezing darkness back into the warm domestic scent of my parents' house. Diane was waiting in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops with a damp cloth. I set the glass angel gently on the kitchen island. She smiled, inspecting the intact wings, oblivious to the heavy gray box I held shielded by the drape of my winter coat. I said nothing to her. I did not ask her about Davenport or Omaha. I did not demand an explanation for the stolen funds. Saying nothing is the armor I have worn my entire life, and I was not ready to take it off. I told her I had errands to run in town and walked out the side door into the biting wind. The drive back to Des Moines took over an hour. The car heater blasted against my frozen legs, but the warmth never seemed to reach my skin. I drove through miles of dormant cornfields, watching the gray sky press down flat against the horizon. The metal tin sat in my passenger seat like a silent living passenger, demanding my constant attention. I kept my eyes on the icy asphalt, focusing on the road ahead, ensuring my tires did not slip on the frozen patches. But my mind was locked inside that gray box, turning over the numbers, turning over the betrayal, and unable to stop thinking about that single unopened envelope carrying a word I was beginning to fear more than the receipts themselves. My Des Moines apartment was silent, except for the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. I stood in the center of my kitchen and set the heavy gray metal box onto the granite countertop. Next to it, I placed the hand-blown glass angel still wrapped in its quilted fabric. Diane had insisted I take the fragile ornament home to carefully polish the glass before our annual tree trimming gathering. Looking at the two objects now, the physical juxtaposition felt like a calculated insult. The sacred and the profane were sitting mere inches apart on my kitchen island. I stared at the tarnished, dented metal of the casino tin and the pristine wings of the angel, trying to reconcile the two vastly different histories they represented. The sight of that fragile glass pulled me backward through time with a sudden, overwhelming force. I was no longer 32 years old, standing in the safety of a home I had purchased with my own pristine credit. I was 18 again, sitting at the far end of the heavy oak dining table in my parents' farmhouse. It was late summer, just weeks before I was supposed to pack my bags for a prestigious out-of-state university. I had the acceptance letter folded in my bedroom upstairs, a piece of paper I had worked 4 years to earn. Richard and Diane sat across from me, holding cups of black coffee. Their faces were carved into masks of perfect Midwestern stoicism. There were no tears in their eyes. There were no apologies offered. My father folded his large, calloused hands over a yellow legal pad and looked at me with a flat, unreadable expression. He delivered the news with the clinical detachment of a bank manager declining a loan. The global market had collapsed, he explained. The economy was in free fall, and the education trust my grandfather had set up for me was wiped out. The funds were gone, swallowed by a financial disaster that was taking down farms and retirement accounts across the state. They told me we all had to tighten our belts and accept the things we could not change. I did not scream. I did not cry or demand to see the brokerage statements to verify the loss. I sat perfectly still, mirroring their rigid posture, because I was learning a fundamental lesson about survival in that house. Watching my parents deliver life-altering devastation without breaking a single sweat, I drew a silent, permanent conclusion about my own worth. I decided right then that love in this family was a transactional currency. It was a currency earned by not needing anything. I realized that if I caused a scene or showed my grief, I would become a burden they could not afford. My only path to keeping a seat at their table was to ensure I cost them $0 and zero stress. My value was directly tied to my ability to carry the heavy weight without ever asking to be carried myself. That was the exact moment I transformed into the reliable daughter. I threw away my university acceptance letter. I enrolled at the local state college and took the closing shift at a diner, smelling of fryer grease and loose meat sandwiches, working until 2 in the morning to pay my own tuition. I became the family shock absorber, so my parents could ride smoothly through what I thought was a shared financial tragedy. But the deepest tragedy of that day was not the loss of the university acceptance or the grueling diner shifts that followed. The true tragedy was how my parents' actions defiled my grandfather's final promise to me. Another memory pushed its way to the surface, warmer and infinitely more painful than the dining room table. I was 8 years old, sitting on the plush carpet of my grandfather's den. The room smelled of cherry wood and sweet pipe tobacco, a comforting scent that always made me feel shielded from the world. He was a large man with a gentle voice and a brilliant mind that understood the power of financial preparation. He knelt beside me, his knees popping loudly, and pressed the delicate hand-blown glass angel into my small palms. He wrapped his rough, warm hands over mine, holding the fragile glass securely so I would not drop it. He looked me directly in the eyes and spoke with a fierce, quiet certainty. He told me he was putting money away for me in a special account that nobody else could touch. He said the world was often hard on girls who had to rely on other people for their survival. He pointed a thick finger at the glass angel and told me to keep it as a reminder of our deal. "This is so nobody can ever tell you no," he said. That single sentence became my North Star. It was the ghost that guided every major decision of my adult life. My grandfather wanted to build an impenetrable wall against rejection. He wanted to make me unrefusable, independent, and secure. I became a loan officer because of him. I became a numbers person specifically to honor the man who tried to buy my freedom. I dedicated my career to understanding ledgers, risk assessment, and asset management, so I would never be caught off guard by a market crash again. The contrast between his intention and my reality was devastating to comprehend. My grandfather had spent his final years building a fortress to protect me from the word no. My parents had spent the next decade teaching me that my only purpose in life was to say yes to every single demand they made. They trained me to say yes to working 3 jobs, yes to driving old, unreliable cars, and yes to shrinking my own ambitions to fit their manufactured poverty. I blinked, pulling myself out of the memories, and focused back on the granite countertop in my quiet apartment. The heater kicked on overhead, blowing warm air across my face, but the deep chill from the farmhouse attic remained lodged in my bones. I looked at the rusted gray cash box. It was a physical tombstone for the future my grandfather had tried to give me. Inside that metal shell was the undeniable proof that the market crash of 2008 had nothing to do with my stolen education. The stoicism my parents displayed at that oak table was not the brave face of resilient farmers enduring a global financial crisis. It was the chilling, sociopathic calm of 2 people who had fed their daughter's inheritance into riverboat slot machines and then looked her in the eye and lied about it. I placed my hand flat against the cool, smooth surface of the glass angel. I did not yet know what I was going to do. The anger was present, a hot, tight knot forming in my throat, but it was fighting against 32 years of ingrained compliance. The girl who learned to cost her family nothing was terrified of the destruction this tin box represented. If I opened this box to the world, I would blow up the family dynamic I had sacrificed my youth to maintain. I was not yet the avenging figure holding a grenade at a holiday dinner. I was just a woman standing alone in a dark kitchen, trying to breathe through a collapsing reality. I pulled my hand away from the angel and moved it to the rusted lid of the cash box. I could not act on raw emotion. Emotion was unpredictable and dangerous in a family that used feelings as a weapon. But I understood numbers. I understood how to read a balance sheet and conduct a forensic reconstruction. I decided in that quiet kitchen to do the only thing that had ever kept me safe in this world. I would understand the data first. I would lay out every casino receipt, every withdrawal slip, and every hidden date on my dining table. I would audit my own parents. I would trace every stolen dollar before I made a single move, because an underwriter does not act on a feeling or a suspicion. An underwriter acts on the undeniable math. The morning sunlight filtering through my apartment window was thin and pale, offering absolutely no warmth. I sat at my kitchen island with a mug of black coffee, staring at the rusted gray metal box that had spent the night exactly where I left it. The hand-blown glass angel sat nearby, safely wrapped in its quilted fabric. I had barely slept. My mind had spent the dark hours rotating around a single terrifying axis, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal locked inside that casino tin. Then the screen of my cell phone lit up against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I reached for the phone, expecting Diane to ask about the delicate glass ornament, or perhaps offer a brief, obligatory word of gratitude for my freezing labor in the farmhouse attic. I should have known better. In my family, gratitude was a wasted currency, and phone calls early on a Saturday morning were never designed to check on my well-being. Diane was calling to collect. I swiped the screen and answered with a neutral greeting. Diane skipped the pleasantries entirely. Her voice was brisk, carrying the purposeful energy of a woman executing a carefully planned agenda. She was calling about Connor. My older brother operated a boutique agricultural supply business, acting as a middleman between organic farmers and upscale urban restaurants. Connor loved the aesthetic of the business. He loved attending networking dinners and printing glossy brochures, but he had zero capacity for actual financial management. Now the brutal Midwestern winter was closing in, the seasonal cash flow had completely dried up, and his vendors were demanding payment. Connor was quietly drowning in debt. Diane explained the situation, using the delicate, sanitized vocabulary she always employed to protect her favorite child. Connor was just experiencing a temporary liquidity issue, she told me. He needed a modest bridge loan, a temporary business line of credit to keep the operation afloat, until the spring thaw brought the restaurant orders back. The bank was willing to extend the capital, but there was a minor complication. Connor's credit score was a little bruised right now, she said. She used the word bruised as if he had simply bumped his knee on a playground rather than systematically defaulting on his financial obligations. Then the true purpose of the phone call arrived. Diane shifted her tone, adopting the sweet, unyielding register she specifically reserved for ultimatums. She told me that Connor needed a guarantor for the commercial note. She and Richard had their capital tied up in the farm machinery and could not assume the liability. They needed me to guarantee the loan. They needed my pristine underwriter credit rating and my stable banking salary to secure his debt. This is the moment I must confess the absolute truth about the psychology of a designated caretaker. Sitting in my kitchen with a box full of evidence proving my parents had robbed my future, I was actually tempted to agree. The conditioning of 32 years is a heavy, suffocating blanket, and it does not simply vanish because you find a rusted cash box in an attic. I picked up a blue ballpoint pen from the counter and rolled it between my fingers. My heart rate accelerated. My brain immediately began calculating how I could absorb the financial blow if Connor defaulted. I had substantial savings. I had a flawless payment history. I could theoretically carry the monthly payments on his commercial line without losing my own apartment. I could fix this for them. The physical urge to comply was a living, breathing force inside my chest. If I said yes, the tension would instantly evaporate. Diane would praise my generosity. Richard would nod his approval the next time I walked into the farmhouse. I would be a good daughter preserving the sacred harmony of the family unit. The reflex to swallow my own safety to protect my brother was so deeply ingrained that my hand literally gripped the pen tighter, preparing to write down the loan parameters on a blank notepad. I wanted the approval. I wanted the warmth of their conditional love, even knowing exactly what that love cost. My mouth opened to speak the words of surrender, to tell her to send me the electronic documents so I could authorize the background check today. I hesitated for a single agonizing second. Into that brief sliver of silence, Diane inserted the final push. "You have always been our reliable one, Skylar," she said softly. That single sentence stopped the breath in my lungs. It was intended as a compliment, a verbal pat on the head to seal the transaction. But standing in my kitchen, looking at the gray metal box that held the ashes of my college fund, the word reliable suddenly lost its virtuous shine. The translation clicked into place with devastating clarity. Reliable did not mean valued. Reliable meant expendable. Reliable meant I was the workhorse expected to pull the heavy wagon while the favored son rode comfortably in the back. Reliable meant I was the daughter who would sleep under 3 blankets in a freezing bedroom so my parents could afford to lose thousands of dollars at a blackjack table in Davenport. They did not respect my financial stability. They viewed it as a natural resource they could harvest whenever Connor required a bailout. The temptation to sign the loan vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, absolute focus. I did not confront my mother about her hypocrisy. I did not scream into the phone about the gambling receipts or demand to know how she could possibly ask me for money after stealing $92,000 from my grandfather's trust. I realized that if I exposed my knowledge now, they would simply close ranks, fabricate a new lie, and find a way to manipulate the narrative before the extended family ever learned the truth. I set the blue ballpoint pen down on the granite countertop. I regulated my breathing, ensuring my voice carried nothing but warm, compliant accommodation. I deployed the decoy. "Bring the paperwork to Christmas dinner, Mom," I said, my tone perfectly mimicking the dutiful daughter she expected to hear. "I will sort it all out there in front of everyone." Diane exhaled a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She praised my sensible nature, thanking me for always keeping the family together. She heard total surrender in my words. She believed the crisis was averted and the safety net was securely in place. She ended the call with a cheerful reminder to arrive early on Christmas Eve to help prepare the holiday roast. I lowered the phone and let the screen fade to black. The reader looking back at the tension of the holiday dinner knows exactly what that promise meant. Diane heard a daughter yielding to pressure. The reality was the sound of a blade being quietly unsheathed in the dark. I turned my full attention to the gray casino tin. The confusion and the grief that had clouded my mind the previous night were completely gone. My objective had fundamentally changed. I was no longer opening those bundles of paper to simply understand a past betrayal. The audit was no longer an exercise in processing trauma. It was an active mission to build ammunition. I needed to assemble a pristine, unassailable portfolio of their deception. I would keep my silence absolute, allowing them to walk confidently into the holiday gathering believing they held all the power. They wanted me to guarantee a loan in front of the entire family. I was going to give them exactly the audience they requested. The audit began the moment I ended the phone call with Diane. I cleared the granite countertop, carrying my coffee mug to the sink and wiping the surface down until it was immaculate. I brought the gray metal box to the center of my dining table. I needed a larger workspace to construct the timeline. From a cardboard storage box in my bedroom closet, I retrieved 4 spiral-bound journals covering the years spanning high school and my grueling semesters at the local state college. I arranged the diaries chronologically on the left side of the table. On the right side, I carefully unbanded the stacks of casino receipts, withdrawal slips, and player account statements. I opened my laptop, logging into a blank spreadsheet file. I am an underwriter, and my entire professional existence relies on the ability to detect patterns hidden within chaotic data. I do not look for singular catastrophic events. I look for the slow, consistent bleed of resources. I look for the narrative the numbers form when they are forced to stand side by side. I began entering the dates and the withdrawal amounts from the casino slips into the first 2 columns of the spreadsheet. Davenport, Omaha, Council Bluffs. The locations varied, but the frequency of the cash advances painted a picture of 2 people spending every spare weekend on a riverboat gambling floor. Once the financial data was logged, I opened my old diaries. My teenage handwriting filled the pages, documenting the daily anxieties of a girl terrified of becoming a financial burden. I started cross-referencing the dates of my parents' heaviest gambling losses with the entries in my journals. The matches I discovered were not perfectly synchronized to the exact hour or day. Perfection in financial fraud is rare and usually indicates manipulation. The matches were misaligned by days, or sometimes a full week, which made the correlation brutally authentic. It was the messy, undeniable pattern of a family living a double life. I found an entry from November of my sophomore year in high school. I had written about the terrible freezing cold in my bedroom because my father claimed the farmhouse furnace was broken and the repair estimates were too high for the family budget to absorb. I had slept under 3 heavy quilts for a month, wearing a winter hat to bed while studying for biology exams. I moved my finger across the spreadsheet to the corresponding month. During that exact same week, Richard and Diane had withdrawn $12,000 in cash advances from a resort casino in eastern Iowa. I turned the pages of the diary forward to December of my senior year. I had documented a Christmas morning where I received a single package of wool socks and a cheap drugstore lotion set. My mother had wept openly in the living room, apologizing for the lean holiday, blaming the global recession and the struggling agricultural economy. I traced the date on the spreadsheet. 3 days before that tearful Christmas morning, my parents had processed a $6,000 wire transfer to a gambling account in Omaha. The emotional impact of these discoveries did not register as immediate fury. It registered as a profound, hollow sickness deep in my gut. The nature of the betrayal shifted fundamentally as I stared at the screen. My parents had not simply stolen the $92,000 education trust my grandfather had intended for my future. That was a financial crime. What they had done to me over the subsequent decade was a sustained psychological violation. They had actively manufactured a state of poverty, forcing me to live in artificial deprivation to cover their losses. They made me believe the world was a harsh, unforgiving place, and that their inability to provide was a tragedy we were all enduring together. They had weaponized my empathy, using my willingness to suffer quietly as the shield that protected their addiction. I had shivered in the dark to subsidize their blackjack hands. I continued sifting through the bottom of the gray tin, pulling out the last few folded papers. Among the ATM slips, I found 2 neatly printed hotel folios folded into thirds. I flattened them out on the table. They were not casino comp vouchers, which are typically non-transferable and useless as concrete evidence of a third party benefiting. These were standard hotel invoices issued directly by the resort properties, paid in full by my father's credit card. I examined the guest names listed on the folios. The primary occupant on both invoices was Connor Edwards. The dates printed on the hotel bills were from the summer I turned 20. I opened the corresponding journal and found the exact weekends. I had been working double shifts at the Made-Right diner, saving every tip to cover my fall semester textbooks. I vividly remembered smelling like grease and industrial floor cleaner, crying in my cheap car because my feet throbbed from standing for 14 hours straight. On those exact same nights, Connor was occupying a luxury suite at a gambling resort, charging room service steaks and premium alcohol to a room paid for by my parents. The realization curdled sour and heavy in my chest. I had always assumed Connor was oblivious to the financial strain, simply protected by our parents' tendency to spoil their firstborn son. These hotel folios proved a much darker reality. Connor was not an innocent bystander shielded from the family struggles. He was a willing participant, actively consuming the resources that had been diverted from my future. He was sleeping in high thread count sheets and ordering room service on the exact nights I was freezing on a diner floor. He knew the money was flowing freely in his direction, while I was told the well was completely dry. My parents had not just protected him from the hardship, they had made him a direct beneficiary of my erasure. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the apartment pressing against my eardrums. The low hum of dread I felt was the sensation of a woman realizing her entire history was a carefully constructed stage play. I remained perfectly calm. I did not throw the coffee mug against the wall. I methodically scanned each hotel folio, each withdrawal slip, and each diary entry, converting the physical evidence into high-resolution digital files. I was building a prosecution binder, proving my own erasure line by line. I needed to secure the final piece of the puzzle, the leverage they were attempting to use against me right now. Diane had claimed they needed my signature to save Connor's failing business because their own capital was tied up in the farm. I opened a new browser window. I am a bank employee with access to sophisticated proprietary search databases, but I deliberately chose not to use them. Utilizing employer systems for personal investigations violates strict compliance regulations, and I refused to give my family any opportunity to claim I had obtained information illegally. I needed my power to come entirely from public records, accessible to any citizen with an internet connection and a basic understanding of county government. I navigated to the public portal for the County Recorder of Deeds. I entered my parents' names and the parcel number for the family farmhouse. The search results populated the screen, generating a list of recorded instruments tied to the property. I scrolled past the original mortgage and the standard agricultural liens until I found a filing recorded exactly 2 years ago. It was a massive cash-out refinance and equity extraction loan secured against the farmhouse. The principal amount borrowed was staggering, far exceeding the value of any routine farm equipment upgrade. Directly below the refinance document, I noticed a secondary filing entered into the public record just 60 days ago. It was a formal notice of default. The lender was initiating proceedings against the property. I stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the dates and the massive debt burden. The narrative Diane had fed me on the phone that morning completely disintegrated. The request for me to guarantee Connor's business loan was a smokescreen. The family farm, the sacred fifth-generation symbol of their Midwestern legacy, was already heavily mortgaged and currently plunging toward foreclosure. I closed the laptop screen. I turned my attention back to the dining table. The thick manila envelope I had discovered at the very bottom of the gray tin was sitting right where I left it. The word reconveyance was scrawled across the front in blue ink. I still did not fully grasp how that specific legal document tied into the massive default I had just discovered online. The envelope sat there, a sealed mystery, containing the final volatile variable of the audit. I reached across the table and pulled the envelope toward me, breaking the dry, brittle seal on the back flap. I pulled the brittle flap of the envelope open, revealing the dense legal text inside, but before I could unravel the full weight of the county terminology, the sheer exhaustion of the weekend finally overtook me. The revelation hidden within those pages would have to wait. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, fluorescent reality of the credit union. I sat inside my glass-walled office, projecting the crisp, professional image of a focused agricultural loan officer. My mahogany desk was immaculate, and my posture was perfectly straight, but my mind was a fractured landscape of casino receipts and hidden foreclosure notices. I needed to keep my composure intact to navigate the day without raising suspicion. My branch manager, Greg, paused at my open door a few hours into my shift to drop off a stack of new commercial loan applications. We chatted briefly about the upcoming quarterly compliance audit that the regional directors were initiating. He reminded me, using the casual tone of a routine corporate memo, about the strict banking regulations prohibiting any employee from accessing the financial profiles of relatives. The internal firewall was sacred, he noted, and any breach meant immediate termination and potential prosecution. I nodded smoothly and assured him my files were pristine. The interaction was brief, but it fortified my resolve. My power in the coming days would not stem from exploiting my employer and their secure proprietary systems. The ammunition I was gathering was rooted entirely in public filings and a rusted tin box pulled from a frozen attic. I was building a cage for my family using only the materials they had carelessly left in the open. The quiet rhythm of the morning broke when a large shadow blocked the ambient light from my office doorway. I looked up from my dual monitors and my pulse spiked. My father stood on the carpeted threshold wearing his heavy canvas work coat and a flat, unyielding expression. Richard had driven over an hour from the farmhouse through the biting winter wind for one singular purpose. He did not knock or ask if I had a moment to spare. He simply walked in, shut the heavy glass door behind him, and lowered his large frame into the guest chair across from my desk. The physical presence of the man in this professional setting was jarring. At the dining room table, he was the benevolent patriarch, but here, removed from his carefully controlled stage, the raw, demanding core of his personality was exposed. He leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on my desk, and dropped the paternal act entirely. The booming, jovial tone he used for holiday toasts vanished. In its place was a low, threatening register designed to corner and compress me into submission. "Family helps family." "Skylar," he began, the words sounding more like a subpoena than a proverb. He did not ask how I was doing or inquire about my weekend. He launched directly into a calculated psychological assault. He told me that my hesitation to co-sign the bridge loan was causing extreme distress back at the farmhouse. He said that if I refused to guarantee the debt, I would break my mother and her fragile heart. Then he shifted his tactic from emotional manipulation to social extortion. He weaponized the tight, neighborly shame culture of our Midwestern community against me, betting that my reputation mattered more than my financial security. "You know how people talk in this town," he warned, narrowing his eyes to drive the point home. "Rumors spread fast when a business goes under. Do you really want to walk into the grocery store knowing everyone sees you as the greedy sister who let her own brother go bankrupt when you had the means to save him?" The staggering irony of his statement sat heavy and suffocating in the small office. The man sitting across from me had fed my college education into riverboat slot machines. He had manufactured a decade of artificial poverty, forcing me to shiver through harsh winters and work grueling diner shifts to pay for my own textbooks. He had stolen my past to fund his gambling addiction, and now he had the sheer breathtaking audacity to look me in the eye and lecture me on greed. He was betting that my fear of public reputation would override my analytical sense. He assumed the obedient, shock-absorbing daughter he had trained for 3 decades would fold under the threat of local gossip. I kept my hands resting loosely on the keyboard. I did not let a single fraction of my internal fury reach my face. The decoy required a flawless performance, and I gave him exactly what he expected to see. I lowered my gaze, adopting the posture of a cornered, dutiful child, overwhelmed by the weight of family obligation. I let my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch to sell the illusion. I allowed a manufactured hesitation to enter my voice, projecting the image of a woman torn between her budget and her bloodline. "I need a little more time to review the amortization schedules," I said quietly, keeping my tone submissive and soft. "I will give you my final answer at Christmas, Dad, in front of everyone." Richard exhaled a short, satisfied breath. He interpreted my quiet compliance as total capitulation on a delayed timeline. In his mind, the public setting of a holiday dinner would guarantee my signature, because he believed I would never dare to refuse him in front of the extended relatives. He stood up, buttoned his canvas coat, and offered a curt nod of victory before turning his back and walking out of my office. He heard a daughter surrendering to the inevitable. The reader holding the context of the casino tin understands that he just accepted an invitation to his own execution. The glass door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the sterile quiet of the credit union. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation slowly drained away, leaving a profound, hollow void in my chest. I stared at the empty guest chair where my father had just been sitting, and for one honest, unprotected moment I allowed myself to grieve. I was not grieving the lost trust fund or the stolen money. I was mourning the death of a hope I did not even realize I was still carrying. Deep down, despite the receipts and the foreclosure notices, a tiny foolish part of my heart had hoped my father would sit in that chair and say something human. I had hoped he might show a flicker of genuine concern for my well-being, or perhaps hesitate before demanding I risk my own hard-earned stability to cover his tracks. I had hoped that seeing me in my professional element might command a shred of paternal respect. Instead, he had looked at me and seen nothing but a resource to be extracted and managed through fear. That realization was the first deep crack of my dark night forming. The illusion of my parents' affection was permanently shattered, and the reality of their ruthless self-interest was a cold, bitter truth to swallow. The ghost of my grandfather standing in his den, telling me he wanted to ensure nobody could ever tell me no, stood in stark contrast to the man who had just left my office, demanding I say yes to my own financial ruin. The grief was heavy, pressing down on my lungs, but I forced myself to breathe through the ache. I wiped a single stray tear from my cheek and squared my shoulders. The sorrow was real, but it would not paralyze me. The time for understanding the betrayal had passed. It was time to build the trap. I finished my shift processing loan applications with a detached mechanical efficiency. When the clock struck 5, I packed my briefcase and drove back to my apartment. I cleared my dining table once again, laying out the fresh manila folders, the color scans of the casino slips, and the master spreadsheet. I prepared my workspace with the meticulous care of an architect drafting a demolition plan. The intimidation tactics had failed. The construction of the dossier was about to begin. The heavy wooden front door of the farmhouse opened, and the immediate overwhelming scent of pork roast and spiced clove washed over my face. It was the signature aroma of my mother and her carefully maintained fictions. The entryway was warm and bright, buzzing with the chaotic, overlapping voices of my extended family. I stepped onto the braided rug and unbuttoned my winter coat, feeling the familiar, suffocating gravity of the house settle onto my shoulders. I carried the heavy leather tote bag in my right hand, keeping my grip loose and casual. Inside that bag, the 3 manila folders rested side by side, waiting for their moment. I walked from the mudroom into the sprawling country kitchen. Diane was fluttering between the double ovens and the granite island, playing the role of the exhausted but noble matriarch. She wore a pristine holiday apron over her tailored blouse, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. She offered me a quick, distracted smile, completely oblivious to the fact that the obedient, shock-absorbing daughter she expected had died the previous night. Connor leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, holding a bottle of local craft beer. He wore an expensive cashmere sweater and a look of absolute supreme entitlement. He was a man whose boutique agricultural supply business was actively collapsing, yet he projected the unearned confidence of a millionaire. He watched me set my coat on a chair and offered a condescending smirk. He took a slow sip of his drink and muttered that he was glad I had finally come to my senses, little sister. He assumed my presence meant I had surrendered. He believed I had brought the commercial loan documents in my bag, ready to sign away my financial stability to save his sinking ship. I did not reply. I did not glare at him or offer a sarcastic retort. I simply offered a mild, flat smile and walked past him into the living room. The decoy was holding perfectly. The living room was crowded with the people who formed the moral backbone of our entire county. Aunt Linda sat on the floral sofa arranging a plate of appetizers. She was a sweet, fiercely loyal woman who baked the county fair pies and genuinely believed the best of everyone in her bloodline. Beside her sat Uncle Dave. He was my father's older brother, and a man carved directly from the frozen Iowa soil. Uncle Dave had worked his neighboring soybean farm for 40 years, enduring droughts and floods with quiet, unshakable integrity. His hands were thick and scarred from decades of manual labor, and he valued honest hard work above absolutely everything else. Richard sat in a leather armchair across from Dave, playing the role of the weary but resilient peer. They were trading polite Midwestern pleasantries, swirling their drinks and discussing the recent winter freeze. I stood near the archway holding my leather tote and listened as Uncle Dave grumbled good-naturedly about the unpredictable nature of farm equipment. Dave took a sip of his bourbon and chuckled, shaking his head. He reminded Richard about the bad season years ago, mentioning the specific year the main tractor transmission blew out right before the frost. Dave said that repair bill nearly cost them the whole harvest that autumn. Richard nodded solemnly, staring into his glass with a practiced look of humble survival. He agreed with his brother, noting how the family always finds a way to scrape by when times get tight. I listened to that exchange, and my pulse remained slow and steady. To anyone else in the room, it was just a nostalgic conversation between two aging farmers reminiscing about survived hardships. But I knew exactly what date Uncle Dave was talking about. I had the spreadsheet in my bag. I knew the truth about the blown tractor transmission and the harvest money. I knew exactly where the funds had gone, and I knew it had absolutely nothing to do with agricultural repairs. I filed the conversation away, letting it sit perfectly in the center of my mind. Diane called from this kitchen, announcing that dinner was ready. The family migrated toward the long oak dining table, scraping chairs across the hardwood floor and taking their usual places. I walked to the far end of the table, taking my lifelong assigned seat. It was the chair furthest from the center of conversation, the designated spot for the daughter who was only supposed to listen and serve. I sat down and placed the leather tote bag on the floor directly next to my winter boots. I kept the zipper completely closed. The next hour was an exercise in excruciating deliberate patience. I sat at the end of the oak table and watched the performance unfold. The family passed heavy ceramic bowls of mashed potatoes and green bean casserole. Silverware clinked against fine china. The conversation flowed easily, bouncing from local town gossip to weather forecasts to Aunt Linda and her new recipe for cranberry sauce. I ate small bites of my food, chewing slowly and listening to the rhythm of the room. This was the quiet, agonizing space where the tension stretched taut across the table. I knew what was resting against my boots. Every polite pleasantry, every shared laugh, every passing of the gravy boat crackled with the invisible electricity of the impending drop. I was an underwriter sitting in a room full of people who were completely unaware that their accounts were currently being liquidated. I let them relax. I watched Diane laugh at a mild joke, tossing her head back in feigned delight. I watched Connor raise his beer to toast his own fabricated future, bragging about a new restaurant contract he claimed to be negotiating. I deliberately let them preen in their false safety. I knew that the longer they sat comfortably inside their curated illusions, the sweeter and more total the collapse would be. I watched my father hold court at the head of the table, commanding the respect of his brother and the admiration of his sister-in-law. He believed his secrets were buried forever beneath the floorboards of his authority. He believed the quiet, reliable daughter sitting at the far end of the table was entirely under his control. As the main course began to wind down, I set my fork on the edge of my plate. I looked around the room, taking in the warm yellow light of the chandelier and the faces of my extended family. For one brief fleeting second, I felt the heavy, seductive pull of the old life. I looked at Aunt Linda and her kind eyes. I looked at the steam rising from the roasted pork. I felt the deep human desire to simply belong to this group, to be a normal daughter in a normal family, enjoying a normal holiday meal. The warmth of the room offered a comfortable, familiar lie. If I kept the zipper closed, I could stay inside this warmth forever. I allowed myself to feel the profound grief of losing that illusion. I acknowledged the ache in my chest, mourning the family I deserved, but never actually had. Then, with the cold, clear logic of a forensic auditor, I let the desire to belong completely evaporate. I realized that the warmth of this room was fueled entirely by my own silently burning future. I was sitting at a table purchased with my stolen education and decorated with my manufactured poverty. I shifted my posture, sitting perfectly straight against the wooden back of the dining chair. The grief was gone, replaced by an absolute terrifying calm. I was no longer the reliable shock absorber. I was no longer the girl who accepted the smallest piece of pie. I was holding the pin to a grenade, and I was completely ready to let it go. The dessert plates were being brought out from the kitchen, and I knew the moment was arriving. I let my right hand drop off the armrest and fall to my side until my fingertips brushed the cold leather of the tote bag, waiting for the signal to begin. The heavy wooden front door of the farmhouse opened, and the immediate, overwhelming scent of pork roast and spiced clove washed over my face. It was the signature aroma of my mother and her carefully maintained fictions. The entryway was warm and bright, buzzing with the chaotic, overlapping voices of my extended family. I stepped onto the braided rug and unbuttoned my winter coat, feeling the familiar, suffocating gravity of the house settle onto my shoulders. I carried the heavy leather tote bag in my right hand, keeping my grip loose and casual. Inside that bag, the 3 manila folders rested side by side, waiting for their moment. I walked from the mudroom into the sprawling country kitchen. Diane was fluttering between the double ovens and the granite island, playing the role of the exhausted but noble matriarch. She wore a pristine holiday apron over her tailored blouse, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. She offered me a quick, distracted smile, completely oblivious to the fact that the obedient, shock-absorbing daughter she expected had died the previous night. Connor leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, holding a bottle of local craft beer. He wore an expensive cashmere sweater and a look of absolute supreme entitlement. He was a man whose boutique agricultural supply business was actively collapsing, yet he projected the unearned confidence of a millionaire. He watched me set my coat on a chair and offered a condescending smirk. He took a slow sip of his drink and muttered that he was glad I had finally come to my senses, little sister. He assumed my presence meant I had surrendered. He believed I had brought the commercial loan documents in my bag, ready to sign away my financial stability to save his sinking ship. I did not reply. I did not glare at him or offer a sarcastic retort. I simply offered a mild, flat smile and walked past him into the living room. The decoy was holding perfectly. The living room was crowded with the people who formed the moral backbone of our entire county. Aunt Linda sat on the floral sofa arranging a plate of appetizers. She was a sweet, fiercely loyal woman who baked the county fair pies and genuinely believed the best of everyone in her bloodline. Beside her sat Uncle Dave. He was my father's older brother, and a man carved directly from the frozen Iowa soil. Uncle Dave had worked his neighboring soybean farm for 40 years, enduring droughts and floods with quiet, unshakable integrity. His hands were thick and scarred from decades of manual labor, and he valued honest hard work above absolutely everything else. Richard sat in a leather armchair across from Dave, playing the role of the weary but resilient peer. They were trading polite Midwestern pleasantries, swirling their drinks and discussing the recent winter freeze. I stood near the archway holding my leather tote and listened as Uncle Dave grumbled good-naturedly about the unpredictable nature of farm equipment. Dave took a sip of his bourbon and chuckled, shaking his head. He reminded Richard about the bad season years ago, mentioning the specific year the main tractor transmission blew out right before the frost. Dave said that repair bill nearly cost them the whole harvest that autumn. Richard nodded solemnly, staring into his glass with a practiced look of humble survival. He agreed with his brother, noting how the family always finds a way to scrape by when times get tight. I listened to that exchange, and my pulse remained slow and steady. To anyone else in the room, it was just a nostalgic conversation between two aging farmers reminiscing about survived hardships. But I knew exactly what date Uncle Dave was talking about. I had the spreadsheet in my bag. I knew the truth about the blown tractor transmission and the harvest money. I knew exactly where the funds had gone, and I knew it had absolutely nothing to do with agricultural repairs. I filed the conversation away, letting it sit perfectly in the center of my mind. Diane called from this kitchen, announcing that dinner was ready. The family migrated toward the long oak dining table, scraping chairs across the hardwood floor and taking their usual places. I walked to the far end of the table, taking my lifelong assigned seat. It was the chair furthest from the center of conversation, the designated spot for the daughter who was only supposed to listen and serve. I sat down and placed the leather tote bag on the floor directly next to my winter boots. I kept the zipper completely closed. The next hour was an exercise in excruciating deliberate patience. I sat at the end of the oak table and watched the performance unfold. The family passed heavy ceramic bowls of mashed potatoes and green bean casserole. Silverware clinked against fine china. The conversation flowed easily, bouncing from local town gossip to weather forecasts to Aunt Linda and her new recipe for cranberry sauce. I ate small bites of my food, chewing slowly and listening to the rhythm of the room. This was the quiet, agonizing space where the tension stretched taut across the table. I knew what was resting against my boots. Every polite pleasantry, every shared laugh, every passing of the gravy boat crackled with the invisible electricity of the impending drop. I was an underwriter sitting in a room full of people who were completely unaware that their accounts were currently being liquidated. I let them relax. I watched Diane laugh at a mild joke, tossing her head back in feigned delight. I watched Connor raise his beer to toast his own fabricated future, bragging about a new restaurant contract he claimed to be negotiating. I deliberately let them preen in their false safety. I knew that the longer they sat comfortably inside their curated illusions, the sweeter and more total the collapse would be. I watched my father hold court at the head of the table, commanding the respect of his brother and the admiration of his sister-in-law. He believed his secrets were buried forever beneath the floorboards of his authority. He believed the quiet, reliable daughter sitting at the far end of the table was entirely under his control. As the main course began to wind down, I set my fork on the edge of my plate. I looked around the room, taking in the warm yellow light of the chandelier and the faces of my extended family. For one brief fleeting second, I felt the heavy, seductive pull of the old life. I looked at Aunt Linda and her kind eyes. I looked at the steam rising from the roasted pork. I felt the deep human desire to simply belong to this group, to be a normal daughter in a normal family, enjoying a normal holiday meal. The warmth of the room offered a comfortable, familiar lie. If I kept the zipper closed, I could stay inside this warmth forever. I allowed myself to feel the profound grief of losing that illusion. I acknowledged the ache in my chest, mourning the family I deserved, but never actually had. Then, with the cold, clear logic of a forensic auditor, I let the desire to belong completely evaporate. I realized that the warmth of this room was fueled entirely by my own silently burning future. I was sitting at a table purchased with my stolen education and decorated with my manufactured poverty. I shifted my posture, sitting perfectly straight against the wooden back of the dining chair. The grief was gone, replaced by an absolute terrifying calm. I was no longer the reliable shock absorber. I was no longer the girl who accepted the smallest piece of pie. I was holding the pin to a grenade, and I was completely ready to let it go. The dessert plates were being brought out from the kitchen, and I knew the moment was arriving. I let my right hand drop off the armrest and fall to my side until my fingertips brushed the cold leather of the tote bag, waiting for the signal to begin. The heavy ceramic plates holding the remnants of the pork roast were cleared away by my mother and Aunt Linda. The rich, savory smell of the main course was slowly replaced by the sharp, sweet aroma of cinnamon and baked apples. Aunt Linda brought out her signature deep dish pie, setting it proudly in the center of the oak table. Cups and saucers were distributed from a wooden tray. The dark, bitter scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the warm air. The mood in the dining room shifted from the focused energy of a heavy meal to the relaxed, sprawling comfort of satiation. Uncle Dave leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket and letting out a contented sigh. Connor picked up a large slice of pie and began eating with casual entitlement. The ambient noise level rose as multiple conversations overlapped across the table. This was the designated window of the holiday gathering where the family mythology was traditionally cemented. It was the precise moment when the struggles of the past year were repackaged into inspiring stories of triumph and endurance. At the head of the table, my father cleared his throat. He reached out and picked up his crystal wine glass and a small silver dessert spoon. He tapped the metal against the rim of the glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut right through the low hum of the conversations. One by one, the relatives stopped talking and turned their attention toward the head of the table. Richard stood up, pushing his chair back across the hardwood floor. He smoothed the front of his sweater and looked out over the assembled family with the benevolent, confident gaze of a monarch surveying his loyal subjects. My father possessed a natural talent for public speaking. He knew exactly how to modulate his voice to project humility while simultaneously demanding absolute attention. For as long as I could remember, his holiday toasts were the emotional centerpiece of our family gatherings. They were never just simple expressions of gratitude. They were highly calculated performances designed to reinforce his position as the indispensable leader of our bloodline. He started by reflecting on the harshness of the recent winter and the unpredictable economic challenges of the agricultural season. He spoke about the resilience required to work the land and the quiet dignity of Midwestern survival. His words were poetic and perfectly practiced. He looked directly at Uncle Dave, praising the steadfast nature of men who do not quit when the soil freezes over and the machinery breaks down. Uncle Dave nodded slowly, his chest swelling with modest, honest pride. Then my father smoothly transitioned to the broader theme of family unity. He declared that a strong harvest is meaningless if you do not have loved ones to share the bounty. He spoke about the unbreakable bond of our family, asserting that our true wealth was not measured in crop yields or bank accounts, but in our unwavering commitment to support one another through times of crisis. The setup was absolutely flawless. He had primed the audience to view any act of sacrifice as a noble familial duty. Then he turned his gaze down the length of the long oak table and locked his eyes directly onto me. The warmth in his expression intensified. It was a manufactured affection, deliberately designed to disarm and entrap. He raised his wine glass slightly higher toward the chandelier. "And I am especially proud this year," he announced, his voice booming clear and resonant across the dining room. "I am especially proud that Skylar is stepping up to help her brother." He paused, letting the heavy weight of his statement settle over the unsuspecting relatives. Connor is expanding his business and navigating some growing pains, and Skylar is providing the financial backing he needs to get to the spring. That is what this family is about. We carry each other's burdens. He held his glass out toward me, inviting the entire room to applaud my supposed generosity. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By framing my forced compliance as a heroic act of sibling loyalty, he had painted me into a corner in front of every person I was supposed to respect. If I were to refuse the loan now in this highly public setting, I would not merely be declining a standard commercial financial transaction. I would be rejecting the core values of the family itself. I would instantly become the selfish villain who ruined the holiday and abandoned her own brother in his hour of desperate need. Richard thought he was delivering the final checkmate. He firmly believed the decoy I had planted in my glass-walled office. He thought he was cornering a daughter who was far too afraid of public shame to ever fight back against his authority. What my father failed to realize was that his trap had sprung completely backward. He thought he was forcing my hand and celebrating a woman who had already yielded to his pressure. In reality, he had just done all the heavy lifting for me. I needed a captive audience to witness the contents of my leather tote bag. I needed the extended family to be seated attentive and focused entirely on the dynamic between my father and me. By turning the spotlight on my financial utility, he had voluntarily gathered every single witness I required. He had constructed the perfect stage and cheerfully handed me the microphone. Aunt Linda was the first person to clap. She beamed at me from across the table, her face shining with genuine ignorant joy, thrilled to witness such a beautiful display of sibling devotion. Uncle Dave joined in, tapping his heavy, calloused hand on the table in solemn approval. The cousins smiled and murmured their agreement, raising their own water glasses. Down the side of the table, Connor lifted his beer bottle, pointing the neck of the glass toward me in a lazy, arrogant salute. He did not mouth the words "thank you." His smug smirk communicated that my money was simply his birthright. The polite applause swelled, filling the warm dining room with the sound of a family celebrating their own comfortable illusions. I sat at the far end of the table and let the applause ring out. I did not smile, but I did not frown. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I let the sound peak. I let the collective satisfaction of the room reach its absolute maximum volume. I allowed my father to stand at the head of the table, bathing in the warm glow of his successful performance. I wanted them to experience the absolute height of their false security, because the higher the pedestal was built, the more devastating the impact would be when the support columns were kicked away. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. I did not feel the fiery heat of anger. The emotion inside me lived entirely in the vast, quiet gap between the deafening noise of their applause and the lethal ammunition waiting by my winter boots. I focused entirely on my own physical movements, ensuring my body betrayed nothing. I picked up the silver dessert fork resting beside my slice of uneaten pie. I moved my hand with deliberate, calculated precision. I set the metal fork down onto the folded linen napkin beside my plate, ensuring that the silver made absolutely no sound when it landed on the fabric. The room was incredibly loud, but my immediate space was a vacuum of perfect, unbroken silence. I looked down the table and let my eyes rest on my mother. Diane was standing near the kitchen archway holding a glass coffee pot. She was smiling broadly, looking at my father with an expression of immense relief and pride. She was thrilled that the financial crisis was averted and her favorite son was protected. We hold one beat on Diane and her perfect, curated appearance. She was still smiling, completely unaware that the smile currently stretching across her face was the very last one she would ever wear at this table. I broke eye contact with my mother. I dropped my right shoulder, slightly dipping my body weight towards the hardwood floor. I reached my hand down into the shadow beneath the edge of the tablecloth. My fingers found the cold metal pull of the zipper on my leather tote. I gripped the small piece of metal. I pulled the zipper backward along the track. The zipper track opened with a low, grinding hum that was entirely swallowed by the continued applause of my extended family. I reached inside the dark interior of the leather tote, and my fingers closed around the thick edges of the 3 manila folders. I gripped the smooth, heavy cardstock and pulled the stack upward, lifting the physical evidence of my own erasure out of the shadows and into the warm light of the dining room. I pushed my chair back against the hardwood floor. The wooden legs scraped loudly enough to slice through the final fading claps of the relatives. I stood up. I did not shout a single word. I did not throw my napkin onto my plate or knock over my water glass in a display of hysterical rage. I moved with the slow, deliberate precision of an auditor entering a hostile boardroom. I stepped away from the far end of the table and began to walk down the length of the long oak expanse. The conversations died out almost instantly. The abruptness of my movement and the absolute blankness on my face signaled a massive atmospheric shift. A sudden suffocating quiet crashed down over the room, replacing the jovial holiday warmth with the sterile, cold tension of a pending verdict. I stopped halfway down the table near the floral centerpiece. I slid the first manila folder smoothly across the polished wood until it rested directly next to Aunt Linda's untouched slice of cinnamon apple pie. I took 2 more steps and placed the second identical folder squarely in front of Uncle Dave, covering the embroidered edge of his linen napkin. I did not pause to look at their confused faces. I continued walking until I reached the head of the table where my father was still standing frozen in his posture of triumphant patriarchy. I held the thickest folder, the master file containing the original trust documents and the highest resolution scans. I extended my arm and laid the manila envelope directly on top of Richard's porcelain dessert plate, right over the intricate gold rim. "I am not signing the loan, Dad," I said. My voice was not elevated. I kept it in the low, steady register I use when explaining a denied mortgage application to a furious client. The flat, unbothered tone carried perfectly through the vast, dead silence of the farmhouse dining room. But I did finally find the accounting for my college fund. The physical collapse of the room happened in an instant, and it was profound. Richard's right hand, which had been moving to retrieve his wineglass, stopped completely dead in the air, hovering uselessly above the crystal rim. The color drained from his face, starting at his neck and rushing upward, leaving his skin the sallow gray shade of old, dirty snow. Near the kitchen archway, the heavy silver serving spoon Diane had been holding slipped from her fingers. It struck the hardwood floor with a loud, jarring clatter that echoed off the plaster walls. Nobody turned their head to look at the fallen spoon. Nobody moved to pick it up. The entire family remained absolutely motionless, paralyzed by the sudden violent rupture of the holiday script. Connor lowered his beer bottle, his smug, arrogant smirk completely wiped away, replaced by the dull, slack-jawed expression of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on a trapdoor. Aunt Linda was the first person to break the frozen tableau. She was a woman whose entire worldview relied on trusting her family, and the aggressive placement of the manila folder clearly disturbed her deep Midwestern sensibilities. She reached out with a hesitant, trembling hand and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. She stared down at the top page of the dossier, which featured the dense grid lines of the master spreadsheet and the high-quality color scans of the rusted casino tin. She squinted, adjusting her reading glasses, clearly struggling to process the chaotic financial data laid out before her. "What is this, Skylar?" she asked, her voice high and thin, vibrating with a genuine, profound confusion. I turned my body slightly so I could address her, while keeping my father squarely in my peripheral vision. That I said, maintaining the cold, clinical cadence of my delivery, is the exact documented timeline of the $92,000 my grandfather left me. It is the money you were all explicitly told vanished in the global market crash years ago. I paused, allowing the massive figure to hang heavily over the uneaten dessert. I was deliberately deploying the first piece of ammunition, holding back the rest of the devastating arsenal. I did not mention the artificial poverty. I did not mention Connor's luxury hotel suites. I did not mention the looming foreclosure of the fifth-generation farm they were currently sitting inside. I was building a rising staircase of revelations, ensuring each subsequent blow would hit an audience that was already reeling from the previous impact. "Go ahead, Aunt Linda," I said, gesturing toward the open folder on the table. "Read the first column. Read where my education actually went." The dining room descended into a silence so absolute and terrifying that the only sound was the dry rustle of paper being turned over by trembling hands. Aunt Linda traced her index finger down the printed rows of the spreadsheet, her eyes moving back and forth between the columns of dates and the corresponding color scans of the casino withdrawal slips. Uncle Dave opened his own folder, moving with a slow, deliberate caution. His thick, scarred thumb pressed down on the corner of the page, flattening the evidence against the oak table. I kept my physical control absolute. The true, devastating power of this confrontation lay entirely in the severe contrast between the explosive, violent nature of the financial betrayal and the eerie, unsettling quiet of my execution. If I had screamed, they could have dismissed me as an ungrateful, hysterical daughter throwing a tantrum to ruin Christmas. By presenting the theft as a dry, undeniable mathematical fact, I stripped my parents of their only defense mechanism. I gave them absolutely nothing emotional to push back against. I watched the faces of the honest, hardworking farmers seated around the table. These were people who woke up before dawn, who repaired their own machinery, and who valued financial integrity above social comfort. I watched Uncle Dave's jaw tighten until the muscles knotted beneath his weathered skin. I watched a younger cousin slowly lower his fork back down onto his plate, his eyes wide and fixed entirely on my father. The dawning horror spreading across their faces was the true engine of the retribution I was enacting. I did not need to punish my parents myself. I simply needed to hand the documentation to the community they had spent decades trying to impress. Richard was still standing at the head of the table, staring down at the manila folder covering his dessert plate. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a falling beam, but had not yet registered the pain. His carefully constructed mask of the benevolent provider was completely shattered, leaving only the raw, terrified face of a thief caught in the blinding spotlight. He opened his mouth, intending to deploy his booming voice to spin a new lie to issue a command, or to somehow magically smooth over the catastrophic reality sitting on his plate. His mouth opened, but he found absolutely nothing there. No words materialized. No booming defense echoed in the room. He simply stood there, mutely gasping for air, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked bursts. The folder was open on the table, and the cold, hard, undeniable facts were exposed to the light. The trap he had confidently built for me had snapped shut permanently around his own ankles, and there was absolutely no closing it. The silence in the dining room stretched out heavy and suffocating, holding the entire family in a collective state of suspended shock. My parents were relying on that silence, banking on the traditional Midwestern instinct to avoid public conflict at all costs. They hoped the polite discomfort of the aunts and uncles would eventually force everyone to look away and pretend the manila folders did not exist. But cowards rely on silence to survive, and I was completely finished letting them survive on my account. I was not going to allow the evidence to remain buried in a quiet, private dispute. I stepped closer to the head of the oak table, picking up the master folder from my father's dessert plate. I opened the cover and prepared to read the undeniable record aloud myself, bringing the second devastating card into the light. I looked directly at my father, maintaining eye contact, until he was forced to flinch and look away. Let us review November of my sophomore year of high school. Dad, I began, my voice ringing clear and authoritative, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. You sat me down in the living room and told me the main furnace was broken and the repair estimate was too high for the family budget to absorb during a bad harvest. You told me we all had to make sacrifices. I slept under 3 heavy quilts for an entire month, wearing a winter hat to bed while studying for my biology exams. I paused, turning my gaze to the extended family, ensuring every single person at the table was tracking the timeline. I flipped to the second page of the spreadsheet. If you look at the third column of the document in front of you, I instructed Uncle Dave and Aunt Linda. You will see the casino withdrawal logs from that exact same week. You did not lose the furnace money to a bad harvest, Dad. You lost $12,000 in cash advances over a single 4-day weekend at a riverboat casino in eastern Iowa while I froze in my own bedroom. A sharp collective intake of breath swept around the table. The nature of the betrayal was shifting right in front of their eyes. This was no longer just a financial crime involving a stolen trust fund. It was the exposure of a systematic, deeply cruel psychological manipulation. My parents had engineered my physical suffering deliberately, manufacturing a state of poverty to hide their own massive gambling losses. They had weaponized my empathy, using my willingness to endure hardship quietly as the camouflage for their addiction. I did not stop. I maintained the steady, methodical pacing of an auditor presenting a final report. I walked the room through the undeniable pattern. I read the date of the spring semester, when I had to beg my mother for $40 to purchase a required college textbook, crying because I was terrified of failing the class. I matched it to the corresponding receipt, showing a $2,000 loss at a blackjack table in Davenport 3 days prior. I detailed the summers I was told we could not afford new tires for my car, while pointing to the thousands of dollars hemorrhaged in Omaha during those same months. Then I reached the entry for December of my senior year. I looked down at the spreadsheet, and for the first time, my clinical composure faltered. I saw the date, and the memory of that morning hit me with a visceral physical force. I swallowed hard, trying to push past the sudden tight lump forming in my throat. I looked at Aunt Linda, whose face was already pale with horror. "And then there was Christmas," I said, my voice catching slightly on the word. I stopped. I had to close my eyes for one brief fraction of a second, taking a deep breath to steady the sudden tremor in my chest. That single small crack in my delivery was the only indication of the massive bleeding wound hidden beneath the ledger. I opened my eyes and forced the professional mask back into place. I received a single package of wool socks that year. I continued the steadiness, returning to my tone. Mom cried in the living room, blaming the global recession and the struggling agricultural economy. 3 days before that tearful performance, you processed a $6,000 wire transfer to a VIP gambling account. You made me feel grateful for socks while you threw away my future. I turned away from my father and shifted my focus down the right side of the table, locking eyes with my older brother. Connor was sitting rigidly in his chair, his expensive cashmere sweater looking suddenly absurd against the backdrop of the exposed financial ruin. His smug, arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a man who realizes his shield has just evaporated. He opened his mouth perhaps to claim ignorance or to distance himself from our parents' actions, but I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. "I know you want to claim you were in the dark." "Connor," I said, my voice dropping into a colder, harder register, "I know you want to pretend you were just another victim of the bad economy, but the 4th page of the dossier proves otherwise." I pulled out the high-quality color scans of the hotel folios and held them up for the table to see. "These are not casino comp vouchers, which are non-transferable," I explained, keeping the facts clean and unassailable. "These are standard hotel invoices issued directly by the resort properties paid in full by Richard and Diane Edwards. The primary occupant listed on these luxury suites is Connor Edwards." I read the dates printed on the invoices, matching them perfectly to the entries in my childhood diary. These dates correspond exactly to the weekends during my sophomore year of college when I pulled double night shifts at the Made Right diner, smelling like fryer grease and industrial floor cleaner, saving every single tip just to make my rent. On those exact same nights, you were occupying a luxury suite, charging room service steaks and premium alcohol to a room paid for by the parents who told me we were broke. You were not ignorant, Connor. You were warm. Connor stared back at me, absolutely mute, the color draining out of his face, until he looked just as pale and terrified as our father. He had no defense. The documentation was pristine and the timeline was undeniable. He had happily consumed the resources diverted from my stolen inheritance, sleeping in high-thread count sheets while I worked myself to the bone. The moral stakes of the room were now fully visible, and the emotional weight of the retribution was entirely carried by the faces of the witnesses. I did not need to gloat or scream, because the reactions of the extended family were doing all the necessary work. These were honest Midwestern farmers people who prized integrity, hard work, and taking care of their own above absolutely everything else. They were currently watching the respectable, pious facade my parents had cultivated for decades dissolve into absolute ash line by line, receipt by receipt. Uncle Dave stared at the hotel folios, his thick jaw tightening until the muscles jumped beneath his skin. Aunt Linda had both hands pressed tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears, mourning the decades of sympathy she had wasted on a complete lie. The younger cousins had stopped eating, entirely pushing their chairs slightly away from the table, as if trying to physically distance themselves from the toxic epicenter of the room. My father remained standing at the head of the oak table, his posture completely broken, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. His skin remained the color of dirty snow, his breathing shallow and rapid. Diane was frozen near the kitchen archway, her hands trembling violently against her holiday apron. The room was saturated with a thick, mounting horror, and the absolute power of the moment lay in the fact that I had not even reached the bottom of the manila folder yet. The staircase of reveals was still climbing, and the family gathered around the ruined dessert plates could sense that the most devastating cards were still waiting to be played. The crushing weight of the exposed receipts pressed down on the dining room until the carefully constructed facade of the Edwards family finally shattered. Diane was the first to break. When the undeniable reality of the paper trail traps a manipulator. Their final remaining defense mechanism is always to pivot immediately into aggressive victimhood. She abandoned her position near the kitchen archway and stumbled forward, her pristine holiday apron suddenly looking absurd against the context of her exposed crimes. The tears began flowing with theatrical intensity, her face crumpling into an expression of desperate, wounded martyrdom. She pressed both hands against her cheeks, sobbing loudly enough to ensure the entire room focused on her distress. "It was an illness, Skylar," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. "We were sick. You have absolutely no idea what addiction is like. It takes over everything. You are being incredibly cruel to drag this out here in front of the whole family on Christmas." She reached out with a trembling hand as if seeking comfort from the very relatives she had spent the last decade deceiving. She was banking on the ingrained Midwestern instinct to comfort a crying woman, hoping the raw display of emotion would somehow blur the sharp edges of the spreadsheet. She wanted the audience to view her as a tragic casualty of a terrible disease, rather than the architect of my financial ruin. Richard recognized instantly that his wife's tearful performance was failing to move the room. He looked at his older brother Dave, expecting to see sympathy, but found only a rigid, stony glare staring back at him. Dave was a man who understood hardship and poor crop yields, but he had zero tolerance for systemic deceit. The victim card was useless against the unyielding integrity of the honest farmers seated around the table. Realizing that the plea for pity was failing, my father reverted to the only other tool he had ever possessed. He chose fury. The gray pallor of terror that had covered his face just moments ago was rapidly replaced by a dark, mottled crimson flush. He gripped the edge of the oak table, his knuckles turning white, and leaned his large frame toward me, projecting pure physical intimidation. "You ungrateful brat!" he snarled, his voice dropping back into the booming, threatening register he had used in my office earlier that week. "I put a roof over your head. I put food on your plate. If this is how you repay your family, then get out of my house right now." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward away from his anger. The intimidation tactics that had successfully silenced me for 32 years were now completely ineffective against the solid armor of the verified documentation. I looked directly at the screaming man and the weeping woman standing at the head of the table, and my voice remained as calm and steady as a flatline monitor. "You were not sick when you looked me in the eye and lied about the market crash for 15 years, Mom," I said, refusing to let her hide behind the convenient shield of addiction. Addiction might explain the casinos, but it does not explain the calculated malice of the cover-up. "You were not sick when you watched me work 3 jobs smelling like grease and floor cleaner while you paid for Connor to sleep in high-thread count sheets. You are not sorry for what you did to me. You are simply terrified that you finally got caught." I watched Diane flinch as the words struck her. For one brief, agonizing half-second, the theatrical mask of the wounded victim slipped away completely. In that tiny fraction of a moment, I saw something raw and genuinely human underneath the manipulation. I saw a woman who possessed a deep, terrible awareness of her own monstrous choices. She had spent a decade and a half constructing an elaborate fictional reality because acknowledging the truth would have required her to despise herself. The lies were the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the weight of her own guilt. I saw the profound, tragic vulnerability in her eyes, and it cost me something to witness it. It did not move me to mercy or tempt me to soften the blow of the audit. The damage she had inflicted was far too deep and intentional for simple forgiveness. But seeing that brief flash of authentic self-loathing prevented me from viewing her as a mere cartoon villain. It confirmed the heartbreaking reality that my mother was a deeply broken human being who had chosen her own comfort over my survival. That realization was a heavy, agonizing stone settling into the bottom of my stomach, laying the groundwork for the exact kind of justice I needed to exact before I walked out the door. I turned my attention back to my father. He was still standing with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, trying to command a room that no longer recognized his authority. The moral gravity of the dining room had completely inverted. The greedy, uncooperative sister narrative he had tried to construct around me during the dessert toast was entirely obliterated. He was now the accused, cornered by the very witnesses he had foolishly gathered to celebrate my submission. The dramatic tension that had been building since I opened the leather tote was paying off in real time, unfolding with quiet, total devastation. I looked at his shaking fists and the veins standing out on his neck. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I simply deployed the hook for the final, most destructive revelation waiting in the manila folder. "And it is not your house anymore, is it, Dad?" I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. The question hung in the air, chilling the room faster than the winter wind outside. The furious crimson flush on Richard's face drained away, instantly replaced once again by the sickly gray pallor of absolute panic. His jaw went slack, and the aggressive posture he had been projecting collapsed entirely. He sank back down into his dining chair, looking suddenly small and incredibly old. "Which brings us," I continued smoothly, keeping the momentum flowing directly toward the final trap, "to the real reason you needed my signature today." Before I could reach into the back of the manila folder to retrieve the final document, the carefully constructed world of the Edwards family began to detonate entirely on its own. The collateral damage of the 15-year deception was no longer contained to my stolen education or my manufactured poverty. The blast radius was expanding rapidly, engulfing the unsuspecting relatives who had sat comfortably at this table for decades, believing they were sharing a meal with honest people. The catalyst for this unexpected secondary explosion came from the right side of the dining room. Uncle Dave pushed his heavy wooden chair backward with a slow, deliberate scrape against the polished floorboards. He stood up. Dave was not a tall man, but he possessed the formidable, dense physical presence of a lifelong farmer. His shoulders were broad, his chest thick from decades of hauling seed bags and repairing heavy machinery in the unforgiving Iowa cold. He was the quiet moral center of the extended family, a man who spoke rarely but commanded instant attention whenever he did. Throughout the confrontation, he had remained seated staring silently at the open folder in front of his untouched slice of pie. Now he was on his feet, his weathered face set in deep lines of grim, terrible comprehension. I was looking down at a very specific row on the master spreadsheet. He did not look at my mother weeping near the kitchen archway. He did not look at Connor shrinking into his expensive cashmere sweater. He locked his gaze entirely on his younger brother sitting slumped and pale at the head of the table. Richard Dave began, his voice remarkably low, but trembling with a barely contained, controlled fury that chilled the room far more effectively than any shouting ever could. He pointed a thick, dirt-stained finger at the grid of numbers printed on the heavy cardstock, October 2012. Dave said, reading the date aloud with deliberate, punishing precision. "You came to my house late on a Tuesday night. You sat at my kitchen table drinking my coffee, and you were practically crying. You told me the main transmission on the combine had blown out right before the frost hit. You swore the entire autumn harvest was in critical danger and that the bank would not extend your operating line of credit any further." Dave paused, letting the memory of the fabricated agricultural crisis settle heavily over the quiet dining room. This was the exact story he had cheerfully recounted just an hour earlier over bourbon and appetizers, entirely unaware that he had been sharing an inside joke with a thief. In agricultural communities across the Midwestern prairie, a threatened harvest is treated as a communal emergency. When a neighbor or a brother asks for help to save their livelihood, you do not ask for collateral. You open your checkbook because you know the land is harsh and survival depends on mutual support. "I loaned you $10,000 directly out of my personal retirement savings," Richard Dave continued, the tremor in his voice growing more pronounced. "I pulled that money out because you were my brother and you looked me in the eye and told me your livelihood was on the line." Dave slowly raised his hand and aimed his calloused index finger directly at the high-quality color scan of the casino withdrawal slip I had printed on the opposite page of the folder. "You lost $11,000 in cash advances at a riverboat casino in Omaha. That exact same week," Dave stated the irrefutable mathematical fact, dropping onto the table like an anvil. The dates were not perfectly synchronized to the exact day, but they fell within the exact same 7-day window. The deliberate imperfection of the timeline made the revelation infinitely more damning. It proved that my father had walked out of his brother's house holding a check meant to save the family farm and had immediately driven across the state border to feed those retirement funds directly into a slot machine. A sharp collective inhalation of breath rushed through the dining room. The aunts and younger cousins sucked in oxygen as the staggering scope of the betrayal finally registered in their minds. This was the third devastating card in the sequence, and it fundamentally transformed the entire narrative architecture of the evening. The scope of the conflict was no longer a private tragedy concerning a daughter and her stolen trust fund. The parents had not just sacrificed their youngest child to feed their addiction. They had systematically defrauded the entire extended family, hiding their staggering gambling losses behind the noble, unassailable mask of agricultural hardship. The crushing isolation my parents had used against me for 15 years instantly evaporated. I was no longer the lone, bitter accuser standing at the far end of the table demanding justice for an invisible slight. I was now surrounded by the very people they had directly robbed. The retribution had become communal. The ledger I brought to the holiday dinner had morphed from a personal vendetta into a full-scale public reckoning. I felt a profound sense of vindication wash over me. The invisible weight I had carried since I was a teenager, the unspoken belief that I was the only person suffering in this house, was finally lifted. I watched the family dynamic curdle and turn toxic in real time. The relatives my father had explicitly gathered to applaud his benevolent generosity were now looking at him with expressions of profound disgust. Uncle Dave, the man whose integrity established the baseline for the entire room, stood tall and immovable, radiating a silent, righteous anger that commanded the space. His quiet devastation landed harder and carried far more weight than any theatrical screaming ever could. He did not need to raise his voice to dismantle my father. The raw betrayal written across his weathered face accomplished the task instantly. Aunt Linda, sitting beside him, began to cry softly. She was not weeping for Diane or offering sympathy for the fabricated illness of addiction. She was crying for the decades of genuine compassion and financial support she had willingly given to a lie. She was a woman who baked pies and offered comfort, expecting nothing in return. She was mourning the realization that her own brother-in-law had viewed her family's kindness as nothing more than an easily manipulated line of credit. The tears spilling down her cheeks represented the death of her innocence and the destruction of her trust. The accumulating weight of every relationship in that room was souring simultaneously. The foundational trust of the family unit was dissolving into toxic sludge right in front of the roasted pork and the cranberry sauce. Cousins who had looked up to Richard as a successful patriarch were now staring at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. The comfortable fictions that had sustained this holiday gathering for decades were stripped away, leaving only the ugly skeletal framework of theft and manipulation. I stood quietly at my position, halfway down the oak table, watching the people I had been instructed to fear turn their backs on the parents who had taught me to fear them. The shift in power was undeniable. Richard was no longer the patriarch, he was a pariah trapped in his own dining room. I allowed the murmurs of shock and the quiet sobbing of Aunt Linda to fill the space for a long, terrible moment. Then I reached my hand back into the deep pocket of the manila folder. I had one final document waiting in the shadows. The most destructive card of the evening remained unplayed, and it was time to drop the anchor on the entire charade. The dining room was already reeling from Uncle Dave's revelation. The shockwaves of his stolen retirement funds were still visibly registering on the faces of my extended family. The atmosphere had transitioned from polite Midwestern holiday cheer to the suffocating heavy dread of a courtroom moments before a guilty verdict is handed down. I stood holding the master manila folder, my hand sliding past the casino receipts and the hotel folios into the very back pocket of the heavy cardstock. My fingers brushed against the thick, coarse paper of the final document I had pulled from the county recorder's public portal. I pulled the document out and laid it flat on the table right next to my father's deserted plate. I did not use any internal banking software or proprietary credit union credentials to obtain this information. I am an underwriter, and I follow the rules. This was a completely open public county filing accessible to any citizen willing to look. I smoothed the crease of the paper, allowing the official state seal to catch the light from the chandelier. "You all think the bridge loan they asked me to co-sign was to save Connor's boutique supply business," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, terrible certainty. I looked down the table at my brother, who was still staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Connor's business officially folded months ago," I announced. "The state dissolved the LLC in September due to unpaid franchise taxes and mounting vendor debt. This emergency request for my signature was never about saving Connor. He was just the convenient excuse." A ripple of fresh confusion moved through the aunts and uncles. If the golden boy did not need the bailout, why were Richard and Diane pressuring me so intensely to guarantee a massive commercial line of credit? I turned my gaze back to my father. He was watching the official county document on the table with the expression of a man watching an executioner load a rifle. 2 years ago, I explained my words, slicing through the last remaining shreds of the family illusion. "You and Mom executed a massive cash-out refinance against this farm. You did not take out an agricultural improvement loan or a reverse mortgage. You extracted hundreds of thousands of dollars of equity directly out of the land this family has held for 5 generations. I tapped the paper, highlighting the principal loan amount printed clearly on the first page. "You took that extracted equity and you gambled every single penny of it away on the riverboats," I said, delivering the first twist of the final revelation. "And because you liquidated the equity, you could no longer afford the new exorbitant monthly payments. You are deep in default. The lending institution filed a formal notice of default 60 days ago." The room went impossibly still. The family farm was the absolute sacred symbol of our bloodline. It was the physical anchor of their entire projected identity. The idea that Richard had jeopardized the land was unthinkable to the people sitting at that table. But the horrifying reality I was about to drop on them was much darker than a simple looming foreclosure. I picked up the manila envelope I had originally found at the very bottom of the gray casino tin. The envelope marked reconveyance. When I had finally opened it in the safety of my apartment, I had expected to find a standard notice of a bank taking possession. Instead, I had found the terminal diagnosis of my parents' entire scheme. I pulled the document from the envelope and laid it beside the refinance paperwork. But the bank is not just initiating foreclosure. I continued lowering my voice so the entire room had to lean forward to hear me. The statutory redemption period lapsed 45 days ago. You ignored the warnings, you hid the notices from the family, and because you did nothing, the lender moved forward with the final judgment. I looked directly into my father's eyes, ensuring he knew exactly how thoroughly I understood his betrayal. This farm was sold at a county sheriff's auction last month. I stated the final devastating twist, echoing in the silence. It is already gone. You do not own the land we are currently sitting on. The collective gasp from the aunts, uncles, and cousins literally sucked the remaining oxygen out of the dining room. The sacred legacy, the sprawling acres of Iowa cornfields, the house where my grandfather had carved the wooden banisters, it was all legally gone, sold off to the highest bidder to cover a gambling debt. There was absolutely nothing left to fight over. The kingdom had already fallen. But the darkest, most sinister part of their deception was not the loss of the property. It was the reason they had summoned me here today. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, retroactively poisoning every single interaction I had experienced with my parents over the past month. Which means, I said, my voice trembling with a sudden white-hot clarity, they did not need my signature on that commercial loan to save the house. They already knew the house could not be saved. The auction had already happened. The eviction notice is undoubtedly arriving next week. I looked at my mother, who had completely stopped crying. The theatrical tears had vanished because even a masterful performance must end when the stage itself is burning down. You did not need me to co-sign a business loan to help Connor get to the spring, I said, directing my words to both of them. You needed my pristine underwriter credit rating and my spotless financial history to secure a massive influx of unsecured cash. You needed my name on the debt, so that when the final ruin arrived, when the eviction happened, and the remaining creditors came knocking, the entire financial collapse would land squarely on my shoulders. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum created by the sheer horrifying scale of their malice. The ask was never help us, I said, articulating the brutal, unforgivable truth. The ask was, let us bury you. This revelation fundamentally altered the meaning of every preceding event. The warm phone call from Diane, the intimidation tactics in my credit union office, the booming holiday toast, praising my generosity. None of it was a misguided attempt to keep the family afloat. It was a highly coordinated, predatory attempt to make their designated casualty absorb the very last of the wreckage. They intended to walk away clean, leaving me financially destroyed, holding the bag for a lifetime of their reckless addiction. They had spent my childhood stealing my past, and today they had attempted to execute a calculated strike to steal my future. Richard physically sank into his heavy wooden dining chair. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a deflated, empty husk. The commanding, prosperous farmer facade was entirely stripped away, revealing the desperate, cowardly thief underneath. He did not attempt to argue. He did not attempt to spin a new lie or shout me down. The documentation was irrefutable, and the timeline of the auction proved his ultimate sinister intent. Diane stood frozen near the archway, her hands resting limply at her sides. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face among the extended relatives. She found absolutely none. Uncle Dave was staring at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Aunt Linda had physically turned her chair away from the head of the table, her back facing the people she had once considered family. The cousins sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that the patriarch and matriarch they respected had actively conspired to ruin their youngest daughter. I reached down and closed the cover of the master manila folder. The satisfying slap of the heavy cardstock echoed in the quiet room. The staircase of reveals had finally reached its absolute apex. There were no more cards to play, no more hidden receipts or secret hotel folios. I had laid the entire rotting architecture of their 15-year deception bare under the bright lights of the dining room chandelier. The family that had spent decades meticulously building an unassailable facade of respectable Midwestern virtue was now standing completely exposed in the smoldering rubble of their own lies in front of every single witness whose opinion they valued. I stood in the center of the silent dining room, looking at the wreckage of the holiday feast. The gravy had congealed in the good silver boat, and the roasted pork sat cold on the serving platter. I picked up the master manila folder from the table, collecting the high-resolution scans, the foreclosure notices, and the spreadsheet documenting my stolen trust fund. I moved methodically, gathering the remaining folders I had placed in front of Uncle Dave and Aunt Linda. I did not rush the process. I tapped the edges of the heavy cardstock against the polished oak table, aligning the papers perfectly, before sliding them back into the deep pocket of my leather tote bag. The smooth zip of the brass track sealing the evidence away sounded remarkably loud in the vacuum of the room. I hoisted the heavy bag onto my right shoulder, adjusting the strap until it settled comfortably. I turned my attention back to the head of the table. Richard was staring blankly at the wall, his posture completely broken, mirroring the collapse of his agricultural empire. Diane was frozen near the kitchen. Her theatrical tears dried up, leaving only the stark, terrified realization of her impending social and financial ruin. "You stole my past," I said, my voice devoid of any anger or heat. It was a simple, unvarnished statement of fact. "You stole my education, and you stole the years I spent freezing and working myself to exhaustion to cover your lies. And today you tried to hand me the massive toxic debt of your future so you would not have to carry the consequences of your own actions." I looked at the two people who had raised me, realizing that the transactional currency they valued so highly was completely bankrupt. "I am a senior agricultural underwriter." I continued adjusting the leather strap on my shoulder. "I evaluate risk for a living. I do not finance lost causes, and I am officially declining your application." The clinical finality of the rejection broke whatever remaining restraint my mother possessed. Diane lunged forward from the archway, her hands outstretched, her face crumpling into a renewed mask of desperate panic. "Skylar, please," she cried, her voice cracking as she reached for the sleeve of my winter coat. "You cannot just leave us like this. We are your family. We need you." I took one deliberate step backward, entirely out of her reach. I did not slap her hand away or shout at her to stop touching me. The movement was not cruel. It was simply a physical enforcement of a boundary that should have been drawn 15 years ago. She stumbled slightly, her hands grasping empty air, and she let out a jagged, hollow sob. She realized in that moment that the reliable, shock-absorbing daughter she had manipulated for decades was permanently gone. The well was completely dry. I shifted my gaze down the right side of the table, stopping on my older brother. Connor was still seated, his shoulders hunched, his expensive cashmere sweater looking entirely out of place amidst the exposed financial devastation. He was staring intensely at the floorboards, completely mute, unable to offer a single word of defense for himself or the parents who had prioritized his comfort over my survival. "You can help them, Connor," I said, my tone perfectly level. He flinched slightly, as if the sound of his own name was a physical blow. He did not look up. "You were always the favorite," I added gently. It was not a sarcastic taunt or a bitter accusation. It was a quiet, profound acknowledgement of the family dynamic, acknowledging the reality that he had reaped the benefits of their deception and was now solely responsible for managing the fallout. It was the sound of a heavy door closing permanently between us. I was officially resigning from my lifelong position as the designated caretaker, handing the burden directly to the son they had chosen to protect. I turned my back on the dining table and began walking toward the entryway. The heavy silence of the room was slowly fracturing behind me, replaced by the rising chaotic noise of a family, realizing the scope of their own internal ruin. I heard Uncle Dave's deep, booming voice suddenly ignite, demanding immediate repayment of the $10,000 he had loaned his brother under false pretenses. I heard the sharp scraping of wooden chairs as Aunt Linda and the cousins began hastily gathering their coats, eager to escape the toxic epicenter of the farmhouse. The retribution I had ignited was completing itself without any further input from me. I had simply struck the match and handed it over. The community they had defrauded was now managing the fire. I stepped from the hallway into the living room, the space dominated by the massive floor-to-ceiling Christmas tree Diane had meticulously decorated. The branches were heavy with glittering ornaments and draped in cascading ribbons of silver and gold. I paused, my boots resting on the edge of the braided rug. I looked past the expensive baubles and located the object I had climbed into the freezing attic to retrieve just 2 weeks ago. Resting on a prominent branch near the center of the tree was the hand-blown glass angel my grandfather had made. The fragile spun glass caught the ambient light glowing with a quiet, enduring purity. I stepped closer, reaching my hand through the artificial pine needles. I carefully unhooked the wire hanger, freeing the ornament from the branch. I cradled the delicate angel in the palm of my hand, feeling the smooth, cool curve of the glass. This was the sacred object, the physical manifestation of the man who had tried to build an impenetrable wall against rejection for his granddaughter. I opened my winter coat and gently slid the glass angel into the deep interior pocket, pressing it safely against my ribs. It was the only item I took from the farmhouse. It was the only inheritance I truly wanted. Nobody in the chaotic dining room noticed my action, and even if they had, nobody would have dared to stop me. I turned away from the tree and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open. The bitter, freezing Iowa night air rushed into the entryway, hitting my face with the sharp, bracing clarity of a physical shock. The wind howled off the darkened cornfields, carrying the scent of snow and frozen earth. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The latch clicked into place, sealing the noise, the arguments, and the demands of the Edwards family inside the house that no longer belonged to them. I did not look back at the illuminated windows. I walked down the gravel path toward my parked car, the frozen stones crunching loudly beneath my boots. As I reached my vehicle, the immense suffocating weight I had carried for my entire adult life finally lifted. The constant underlying anxiety, the relentless pressure to be useful and accommodating completely evaporated. But the sensation that replaced it was not the bright, triumphant euphoria I had anticipated. I stood in the freezing dark holding my car keys, and I allowed myself to feel the true, terrible cost of the victory. The retribution was successful, the audit was flawless, and my future was secure. But underneath the vindication lay a deep, profound grief. I had achieved absolute justice, and in the exact same breath, I had permanently lost my family. The parents I had tried so desperately to please the brother I had sacrificed my own youth to protect, they were gone, irrevocably severed by the undeniable truth of their own greed. I let the sorrow wash over me, acknowledging the hollow ache in my chest, mourning the fundamental human connection I would never experience with the people who raised me. I unlocked the car door and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, letting the heater roar to life. The physical cold in the cabin began to recede. I reached inside my coat pocket and my fingers brushed against the smooth glass contour of the angel resting against my ribs. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs completely. It was the first full, unburdened breath I had taken in 15 years. The air tasted clean and sharp. The grief was real, and it would likely linger for a long time, but it was a clean, honest grief no longer tainted by manipulation or deceit. I put the car in gear. My grandfather's promise echoing across the decades was finally kept. Nobody ever again could tell me no. 6 months have passed since the freezing December night when the truth finally unsealed itself. The harsh Midwestern winter surrendered to a muddy, unpredictable spring, and now the early summer heat settles over the Iowa prairie. The fifth-generation Edwards farm, the sprawling acres of fertile cornfields, and the sturdy oak dining table where I delivered my final audit no longer belongs to our bloodline. The property was sold at the county courthouse auction in April. There was no dramatic rescue and no last-minute intervention to halt the proceedings. The auctioneer struck a wooden block with a gavel, and the deed was transferred to a corporate agricultural conglomerate. Strangers now drive modern green tractors across the soil my grandfather worked. The sacred legacy my parents used as an impenetrable shield evaporated, returning to the earth it came from. The physical anchor of their projected identity was erased by the simple, undeniable math of unpaid debts. Richard and Diane do not live in a spacious farmhouse anymore. They rent a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a generic, sprawling complex 2 towns over. I do not drive past their new residence, but the rural grapevine functions with ruthless efficiency. In a farming community that values honest labor and neighborly trust, a betrayal of that specific nature cannot be contained or spun into a softer narrative. The details of the stolen retirement funds, the unpaid loans, and the casino receipts circulated through the local diners, hardware stores, and church pews. Their county-wide reputation, the pristine, respectable facade they prioritized over their own daughter, dissolved into permanent disgrace. Uncle Dave and Aunt Linda severed all contact with them the very week after the Christmas dinner. The remaining aunts and cousins followed suit, leaving my parents isolated. I did not have to orchestrate their social exile. I did not campaign against them or ask anyone to choose sides. The fraud itself severed those bonds. The lies they told to maintain their status became the exact instrument of their ruin. They are living the quiet, invisible life they once tried to force onto me. My older brother experienced his own harsh collision with reality, without my underwriter credit rating to absorb his liabilities, and without our parents' ability to shield him from consequence. His boutique farm-to-table supply business officially filed for bankruptcy before the snow melted. The networking dinners, the expensive cashmere sweaters, and the glossy promotional brochures vanished. For the first time in his life, Connor had no safety net to catch him when he stumbled. But I do not view his current situation as a cruel punishment. There is a quiet, unvarnished dignity in what he is doing now. He works as a shift manager at a regional hardware store. He wears a branded uniform polo shirt and clocks in early to organize inventory, sweep the aisles, and manage the floor staff. He is finally paying his own rent and buying his own groceries, relying solely on the hours he works. He is learning the actual weight and value of a dollar earned through sweat rather than entitlement. I feel no desire to gloat over his reduced circumstances. He is simply experiencing the standard adult reality that the rest of us have navigated for years. My own trajectory followed a vastly different path. My career at the credit union flourished, and in the spring, the executive board promoted me to the position of senior underwriter. But the true measure of my victory is not a corporate title or a corner office. The victory surrounds me right now. I am no longer standing in a freezing, drafty attic, sorting through boxes of other people's hidden secrets. I am standing in the center of my own living room. It is a beautiful mid-century house nestled in a quiet, established neighborhood in Des Moines. The architecture features clean lines, large windows, and a wide wraparound porch that faces a street lined with mature oak trees. I did not need a co-signer to buy this place. I did not need family assistance or a hidden trust fund to secure the keys. I purchased this property using the pristine financial history I meticulously built over a decade of disciplined, unglamorous labor. The mortgage is solely in my name. Every square foot of hardwood floor, every painted wall, and every inch of the front porch belongs entirely to me. I would be lying if I claimed the transition was entirely painless. Achieving justice does not magically erase the human ache of losing the people who raised you. You can sever toxic ties and still mourn the fundamental connections you were supposed to have. That quiet sorrow flared up unexpectedly a few months ago when my cell phone screen lit up with a single text message from Connor. It was the only direct communication I had received from any of them since the night I walked out the heavy wooden door. The message was brief. He wrote that he did not know about the trust, and he said he was sorry. I sat on my new sofa and read those 2 sentences multiple times. I searched my chest for a surge of anger or a desire for retaliation, but I found neither. The burning resentment had exhausted its fuel, leaving behind a calm, empty space. I believe he was telling the truth about being kept in the dark regarding the origin of the funds, even if he eagerly consumed the benefits of the theft. I do not hate my brother. I simply have nothing left to give him. The foundation required to sustain a healthy relationship was never built between us. I read the message. I turned my phone face down on the coffee table, and I never sent a reply. I have made my peace with the silence. I walked across the living room holding the fragile hand-blown glass angel my grandfather had crafted so many years ago. The morning sunlight poured through the large front windows, casting bright rectangular shapes across the floor. I tied a thin piece of silver ribbon through the glass loop at the top of the ornament. I reached up and suspended the angel from a small brass hook secured directly in the center of the largest window. The spun glass caught the morning light, refracting the golden rays and casting tiny shimmering prisms across the painted walls. The ornament turned slowly in the gentle air currents circulating through the room. I stepped back and watched it spin, feeling a profound, enduring sense of resolution settle into my bones. For 32 years, I operated under a crippling misbelief. I genuinely thought my worth was tied solely to my utility. I believed that my seat at the family table had to be earned by remaining invisible, by absorbing their debts, and by ensuring I cost them nothing. I traded my own comfort and my own future just to maintain the illusion that I belonged to a cohesive unit. Standing in the warm light of my own house, I finally understand the truth. A table is only worth sitting at if you can bring your whole unedited self to it. You do not have to purchase the right to exist. You do not have to shrink your life to fit inside the narrow, selfish margins of the people who refuse to value your presence. I watched the glass angel catch another beam of sunlight. My grandfather had pressed this fragile object into my small hands and promised it would serve as a shield. He wanted to ensure nobody could ever tell me no. It took a decade of artificial poverty and a confrontation that burned a family myth to the ground, but his promise is finally fulfilled. The ledger is closed. The audit is over. I walk into my own dining room where the morning sun warms the smooth surface of the wood. Nobody can dictate my worth. Nobody can tell me no. I pull out a chair, I set my own table, and I sit down. I sit at my new dining table with a cup of black coffee, watching the glass angel turn slowly in the morning light. The quiet in this house is entirely different from the silence I grew up with. The farmhouse silence was heavy loaded with secrets and unspoken debts. This quiet is light. It is the sound of a ledger finally balanced to zero. Looking back at the freezing attic and the explosive Christmas dinner, I realized the true value of what I found in that gray metal box. It was not just the proof of a stolen college fund. It was the harsh, necessary education my parents accidentally gave me. I learned first that keeping the peace is a dangerous illusion when you are the only one paying the price. For 32 years, I believed that swallowing my needs kept my family together. But silence is not peace. It is simply a high-interest loan you take out against your own soul, and eventually the principal comes due. I learned, second, that when dealing with manipulators, the truth must be written down. Tears and guilt trips live in the air where they can be twisted and denied, but paper trails do not lie. A bank statement, a hotel folio, a county foreclosure notice. These are the cold, hard facts that melt through the thickest facades. Documentation is the ultimate armor against gaslighting. Third, I finally understood that love should never operate like a commercial lease. A true seat at the table is given freely, not rented out in exchange for your total erasure. If your family demands your financial or emotional ruin as the price of admission, you are not a daughter or a sister. You are just a resource being mined. Fourth, I learned the hard way that you cannot heal broken people by bleeding for them. I thought being the reliable shock absorber would eventually earn me their respect. But people who are willing to watch you freeze while they gamble your future will never magically wake up and appreciate your sacrifice. They will simply expect you to keep freezing. And the fifth most vital lesson is that walking away is not a failure. It is the ultimate victory. Blood does not obligate you to finance your own destruction. The moment you stop shrinking to fit into spaces that were built to crush you, you discover exactly how tall you can actually stand. I finish my coffee and set the mug down on a table purchased with my own honest work. My grandfather wanted me to be unrefusable. It took losing everything I thought I knew about my family to figure out how to give myself the ultimate yes. If you are sitting in the dark right now, carrying the weight of a family that only values you for what they can extract, hear my voice. Stop paying the emotional debt they racked up. Check the receipts, gather your proof, and build a life where nobody can ever tell you no. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If my story gave you the courage to stop being the family shock absorber, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Ariana Revenger for more stories of quiet women who finally set the record straight.